We had a pretty successful rainwater harvesting workshop a few weeks ago, but for people who either can't or didn't want to participate in something like that, I wanted to make sure that that information was still easily available to people, and there is plenty of rainwater catchment information on the internet. You can look at, certainly just go ahead and Google rainwater catchment systems or rainwater catchment permaculture, and they'll have a lot of really great ideas. But I'll just go through, and I'll go ahead and post these worksheets on our website. But the reason that we're able to do rainwater catchment for the nursery is actually because we've got a grant through Flagstaff Foodlink, which I'll actually link in the description below here as well. For anybody who's interested, they give out grants for people that are increasing food availability within our community. So they provided us with funds so that we could get a water pump for our large water tank in the front. So just briefly starting to go into the basics of rainwater catchment. I want to talk about the benefits of rainwater catchment. So a lot of folks aren't aware of this, but rainwater is significantly better for your plants. It doesn't have a lot of the chemicals that they put in, like the chlorine and things that our city is really required to put in to make the water safe for drinking. But it's not necessarily great for you, also not great for the plants. Rainwater is also higher in nitrogen. The water that's currently running off of our roofs and off of our property is treated by the city of Flagstaff as wastewater. So it goes through it goes through water treatment plants and then is put back into the landscaping, or back into our natural environment like Picture Canyon. You're helping to reduce the amount of groundwater that we are pumping in order to use as drinking water and also on people's landscapes and gardens and things. So as I'm sure most folks are aware, here in the Southwest we only have so much water, so we have to use it as responsibly as possible. And then lastly, it makes us as individuals a lot more self-sufficient if you have water on hand, especially if you are using it for everything from drinking water to your garden. You know, if you're using it for showers and for your dishes and everything as well. I think it's always fair to talk about downsides, because people want to make it seem like everything is just all upsides when it comes to anything that is environmentally friendly. But the downsides, there are a few. The expense of the infrastructure is probably the first one that people run into. And as I go through this, I'm going to talk about ways that you can make it so that the system that you have is not expensive, even if that means that you're passively collecting rainwater as opposed to actively putting it in storage containers. Because you certainly can, you know, set up a system that passively uses and stores rainwater in your landscape that's gonna benefit you significantly. So other downsides are that you'll probably run into issues with water contamination depending on the type of roof that you have, depending on what issues we're having with chemicals in our atmosphere. So if you're catching rainwater off of a kind of a standard shingle roof, you know, that water is not something that is really recommended that you drink. If we have extremely hazy days, and there's oftentimes atmospheric contaminants that you may or may not need to worry about. So those are just things to kind of keep in mind. Those aren't big issues if you're talking about using the water for landscaping. Even if you do have things like fruit trees, because trees and plants are, as a general rule, do a really good job of making sure that their fruits are contaminant free, even if you were watering with, say, water that was high in arsenic, which would be groundwater. You don't really need to worry very much about those contaminants ending up in the food that you're eating. But if you're catching off of your roof and then you're growing something like beets, where it's actually the root of the plant, or you're eating the leaves or the stalks of a plant like lettuce or kale, that might be something that you'll want to consider a little bit more. So it might change what you decide that you're going to plant or how you're going to water. If you don't have a lot of space, you can do water storage that is either underground, things like cisterns, or you can do less water storage, or you can do passive water storage where you just direct the water into the spaces that you want it to be, and then make sure that the soil holds the water really well. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But there are a variety of different size water containers, and there's also water bladders, which are things that you could roll up and move into your garage or somewhere over the winter, so it would only take up space certain times of the year. So there's definitely a lot of storage options that kind of help you to manage space concerns. And another downside is, you are increasing the amount of labor probably that you're going to have to put into water. It's not that you just turn on the tap. You're going to be managing your own water system, and that is an extra level of responsibility. So that's something to consider. I think it's important to first set out with the question of what is it that you need? What are you trying to accomplish? So is this water only going to be for your yard and garden, or do you want to use it for like bathing and drinking? So that's going to determine probably how much money you're going to have to put in up front in order to make a system that will work for what you need. If you're just looking for landscaping, you might not need to put any money in. You might just have to do a little bit of extra labor in your yard to increase, to make sure that the water is moving where you want it to move, and to make sure that your soil is storing the water properly. So yeah, that'll determine the best way for you to collect and store water. And there is no one size fits all water catchment and storage system. So if people are telling you you have to do it a certain way, just keep in mind that you can kind of hybridize your systems between active and passive rainwater catchment, or go ahead and just go hardcore one way or the other, depending on your needs. If you really need to catch every drop so that you can use it for your household needs, it'll be all active rainwater catchment. But if you don't have funds and you're just interested in using it for your yard, it can just all be passive rainwater catchment. Alright, so what are you going to need? So the first thing that you're going to need is a surface to catch off of. So most people think of their roof when you think of what your catchment system is going to be, and certainly that's where most people are going to be catching water off of. But keep in mind that you can catch water off of your driveway and direct it into your landscaping, as well as pathways and any other hard surface that that's on your property that you could, sheds, you could go ahead and either catch or direct that water. The cleaner the surface, the better. So if it is off a driveway, keep in mind that there's going to be probably oil and other vehicle residue in there. There's a lot of dust and other gross stuff that settles on your roof, so you don't necessarily want that going directly in your water tank. So you'll probably want to do what we do and either wash off your roof real quick in the spring, or you can use a first flush, or you can. The downside of that being that it doesn't handle winter real well. That can break it if it has to go through the winter season. And the first flush is kind of cool, though. It does, it like fills up a little bit with the first amount of water that comes off of your roof, and then it goes ahead and diverts it into your tank after it's gotten that first little bit, and that works every time that you're doing rainwater collection. So that is really nice in that way. You can also they have like these little downspouts that are like a Y, and you can switch it in between sides, and once you can just switch it so that it goes out of your tank for a little bit, but you have to be there in order to do this, or you could just let your first rain go off of your roof, and then switch it over so that it goes in your tank after that. So that is a solution. So you also need water transportation. So off of a roof, that would be gutters. The downside of gutters in Flagstaff, I mean, gutters are an expense. They also collect leaves and needles. And then because Flagstaff has some extreme weather here and there, if we get a good sized snowstorm, the snow coming off of the roof, sliding and melting off of the roof, or moving even kind of like a glacier, where it'll just like slowly shift down and like melt and freeze and melt and freeze, they can either tear the gutters off of your roof, or they can damage them. And I'll include a picture here of what we have. We've got gutter, well, we've got like a bar across our roof that holds the snow so that it doesn't rip our gutters off. The little tabs that I've seen on other roofs, those get ripped off as a general rule also, so I wouldn't recommend those. And this is less of an issue if you have a tar paper roof, because the snow doesn't slide off like it does with a metal roof. So if you have a tar paper roof, this is probably less of a concern. But both types of roofs, you can also get those, they're like little heating wires that you put on your roof, and it melts the snow that's like right up against the edge of your roof. And that's also nice for not having large chunks of snow fall on you or your vehicle. So those might be something you would consider getting. Definitely if you have a metal roof, you need to put something up to protect your gutters so that you're protecting your investment. But you don't necessarily need to have gutters. You also have the option, and I did this for a long time before we got gutters, is you can just set up a row of rocks underneath your roof where the water comes off. And then that way the water's hitting a hard surface that it's not going to damage, and then if it's in like a dip, then it allows it to sink down, and then you can plant on either side of that. You don't want to plant directly underneath your roof, because falling snow and intense rainstorms will wash things out. So it is really nice to have, like, river rock is always really pretty, and just have like a little dip in your landscape where it can just kind of like cup it and like allow it to soak into the ground. You can also do, if you've got some texture to your property, if you've got like highs and lows and it runs a particular direction, you can put in those little dips and then direct it towards trees or catchment basins, so that you're able to kind of move the water more around your landscape. Our property is very flat, so we wouldn't be able to move the water from where the roof comes off to other parts of our landscaping. So those are things that you can keep in mind if you want to do more passive rainwater catchment, because you don't want to have to put gutters on. So you can also use, let's see. So if you do have gutters, then you also have to keep in mind that you're going to need to clean your gutters periodically, especially if you have trees right above where your gutters are, which we have several, so we do have to go up there, and we do it by hand. They also have gutter guards that you can get that are screens that fit over the top of your gutters, and that works pretty well. But those do eventually also end up with a layer of leaves or needles on top of them a lot of times, so you still have to go like scrape those off like once a year. So that's not a huge deal. So then there's also the question of, are you going to need a pump? So we need a pump if we're going to effectively use our water that we have caught in order to irrigate. And a lot of people just plan on using gravity feed, which if you have smaller tanks, or if you have tanks that are either up on top of something or are up on a hill, if your property slopes, and you can put them up on a hill so that they're probably at least 5 to 10 feet up, so you can get some water pressure, then that can work. But if you have a tank that is on the ground, you will have to have the patience of a saint in order to make that work if you're trying to use it to water your landscaping. Just because it will trickle. It will not be like a hose where you're like, psh, it will just like very slowly trickle. So if you do want to use it for landscaping, keep that in mind. I have seen people who have rainwater barrels, the 50-gallon barrels, and they set those up on something just a couple feet, and that seems to work relatively well. It's not a real fast stream, but it's fast enough that you're not going to get horribly frustrated. But so we went ahead and we got a pump, and what pumps are, you know, they can range anywhere from like $50 to like a couple $1,000 depending on how fancy you want to go. And there are a lot of different companies that will sell them. There's multi-use pumps. So the pump that we got, I'll just show you. So this is the pump that we were able to purchase with our grant money from Flagstaff Foodlink. And this is a really nice pump. It is about $700. It has an inlet and an outlet. It will maintain water pressure on demand. So if it is on and I you know, turn on my little hand water breaker, then it will maintain the water pressure in the water breaker. It'll automatically kick on. Another really nice feature that it has is that it has run dry protection. So if our tank runs out of water and I don't realize it, it's not going to destroy the pump, which is something else you have to keep in mind can happen if you get something that does not have that. So you can get like submersible pumps, which are pretty inexpensive, that you will just stick down in a tank, as well as pumps that you can just hook up to the tank. Some of those need to be primed though, so keep that in mind also, in order for them to even start pumping, which is an extra step. If we weren't getting this one and we had a tank where it would work, we would probably be getting a submersible pump. But remember, most submersible pumps and most pumps that you get in general are not going to have run dry protection. You need to make sure that if you're watering, you're paying attention to the water level in your tank. There is also options. I saw this and it was really cool. Someone had water barrels and they set them up to a water timer, which will usually run on a battery system that was hooked up to irrigation lines on their property. So that kind of like skipped all of the extra steps. So you don't have to worry about a water timer having issues with run dry, because it's just a valve that opens and closes on a timer. And if you're okay with it just going at a trickle, then you can just turn on your irrigation system for an hour, and then if there's anything in the water barrel, then it'll go ahead and water for an hour. The downside of that being that you couldn't have a real lengthy irrigation system because there wouldn't be enough water pressure to get water all the way to the end of the irrigation system. So that could work well in like an immediate area. So that's a good kind of active passive way to water if you didn't want to make the investment in a pump, because it's also important to remember that if you get a pump, you have to protect the pipes and the pump from freezing. Hard freezes are what you really need to worry about. You can put them underground or buy containers that are supposed to keep them from freezing, but we do get really intense freezes. So I am not going to use this water pump late into the season when I'm starting to worry about hard freezes, because I don't want to damage it. So at that point I'll go ahead and drain the pump, and we'll go ahead and switch back to using probably some gravity fed water and using city water again. But because most of our rainwater will come during monsoons, hopefully, I still can use do a decent amount of rainwater harvesting water for the nursery. Okay, so active or passive rainwater storage is something that I've been talking about a lot throughout this. So if I wasn't clear about that before, active rainwater storage is if you actually are planning to put it in some sort of storage container that you can use, and there's a variety of storage containers. I've got some good pictures of some of those here. So we've got in the upper left a water bladder, which is probably usually 20 to 40,000 gallons of water can be stored in that. And then I've also got some rain barrels on the bottom left, which are what most people are used to seeing. And you can hook up several of those or just do one. And then the illustration on the bottom shows a combination of active and passive rainwater catchment. You have that in there? Yeah. And you can see a large plastic water tank. And then the overflow from that water tank goes into a passive water storage system. So that, in my opinion, is the ideal, where you have some active water storage and then some passive water storage as well. That way you always have, or hopefully almost always have, some water stored in a container that you can water as needed, but most of your water, or a decent amount of your water, is just going directly into the landscaping where the plants need it, so that you don't have to be putting in a ton of work to keep things watered if we're already getting some precipitation. So depending on how you're storing your water, you're going to need to contemplate protecting your water storage containers. So the large and small plastic tanks are usually made from a very hard plastic that has a decent lifespan, 10 to 20 years, but we are at 7,000 plus feet depending on where you're at, and the sun and UV is really intense, so you have to keep that in mind. We put our water storage tank in the shadiest spot that we could find where it would fit, in hopes of being able to extend its lifespan. So I would not put it on like a south facing wall that's really hot, because you're going to decrease the lifespan of your water tank. They also, I mean, you have to worry somewhat about freezing. I haven't run into too many issues with that damaging water tanks, just because the water is such a large mass that it's not going to freeze solid. So you don't really have to worry about it cracking your water storage tank, unless you have like a very skinny storage tank, which I've never seen one like that, and that's probably why. For the most part, I haven't run into anybody vandalizing water tanks, although I have had neighborhood kids come and drain our water tanks before, not understanding what it was they were doing, and just wanting to play in the water. So that's something to keep an eye on, I suppose, as well. It's not a bad idea to keep the valves maybe covered so that they're not as obvious to passersby. As it stands currently, so the rule of thumb has been 1 gallon of water storage is $1. So if you wanted 1,000 gallons of water storage, you'd be looking at $1,000 water tank. And that is not exactly true anymore. It's probably like $1.50 to $2 now, which I think has made it so that a lot of people aren't as interested in doing water storage, which makes it so that people are maybe looking a little more towards passive water storage as opposed to like large water tanks anymore. And so that's true for probably metal tanks and plastic tanks. Metal tanks are great if you can find them, but you do have to worry somewhat about the material that they're made out of and whether or not they're going to leach metals into your water, so just keep that in mind. Some of them are for potable water, some of them are not, and so you just have to be aware of what you're getting and know what your uses are. A cost-effective way of doing water storage is water bladders. You can get them, I've seen them online, and they're kind of spendy if you get them that way. But you can get them through Army Surplus. They have extremely large water storage bladders if you have the space to put them somewhere. We're talking like 10, 20, 40,000 gallon water bladders that they sell. Some of them are not used. Some of them have been used for gas. So you have to keep in mind if you want to get one of those that'll be kind of icky initially. But those are really great if you have a lot of water you need to store or want to store, and you have the space to put one of those. So that's a great option in that case. If you decide to do an open water storage tank, which I'll include photos of those, we had open water storage tanks as our first iteration of water storage off of our building, and they're really great because you can just like go dip out of them with a watering can, so I really like that about them. The downsides were that we had a lot of stuff end up in them, so algae, mosquitoes. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of rat tail maggots, but they're really unpleasant looking. You also have to consider if your rainwater catchment system, if you're going to do something like a pond, or if you have an open tank, is risk to kids and pets as well. Like, is anybody going to fall in there and not be able to get back out? So these are all things you need to consider. We did do our best to mitigate our insects by adding fish to our water, but our tanks were metal, so it wasn't ideal conditions. We were using feeder goldfish. And we also, so it wasn't as big of a concern since goldfish are extremely hardy. You can also cover them with like mesh or something that lets the water through, but you're not going to end up with a lot of stuff in there. So there are lots of options for managing that as well. Forestdale Farm has a really great example of a pond. I think it can store like 13,000 gallons of water, and it's got a relatively small footprint. It's just very deep. And then that has a pond liner in it and could theoretically have, I'm not sure if they're doing that now, I know they do some aquaponics. It can have fish in it also, which can be kind of cool. Something you have to keep in mind though is that any open water storage container is going to have a lot of evaporation out of it. The greater the surface area, the more evaporation you're going to get, so you might want to try and figure out a way to make sure it either stays shaded or has some sort of cover. But ideally you go for depth. You don't want it to be really wide and shallow. You want it to be really deep and have like a small surface area that's exposed to the sun. So something, let's see, if you're doing passive rainwater catchment, something that is really important, it depends on what your soil type is here. Where we're at, our soil is very porous. It's very sandy, silty. So water that goes into the soil has a tendency to just percolate right down through it. If you increase the organic matter in your soil by adding things like compost and manure, you can increase your soil's water storage capacity by several fold. I think it's like 3 to 5 times the amount of water storage in the soil itself. And I've experienced this personally because we've been adding organic material to our yard for years, and the areas that we have added a lot of organic material to, I have to water significantly less often. The trees are a lot happier because the soil is basically more like a sponge as opposed to like a sieve. So that's something to really keep in mind if you are gonna put in the time to go ahead and dig out an area to try and help that water percolate into the soil, and then make sure to add a lot of organic material to that soil so that it'll hold that water so the plants can use it when it's dry. So it's important if you're going to do active rainwater catchment to go ahead and calculate how much water you're going to have coming off of your roof. So you have this worksheet that I pilfered from my permaculture course a while ago, and I will go ahead and put this worksheet up on our website, free to use for folks. And so you start out, I have an example of our roof, if you have any desire to take a look at that. So once you figure out, so it's important to go ahead and go through and figure out what your surface area is, which is relatively easy. You just do length times width. And then once you have your surface area, Flagstaff is an average of 23 inches of rain per year, which varies a lot. And where you are is going to determine a little bit. You can find rainwater catchment for the specific area that you're in, or if you can find rainwater averages, then that would be good, because it does vary a decent amount depending on where you are in town or out of town. But on average, you can go ahead and just plug in 23 inches, and then you're going to multiply that by 0.623, and then you're going to multiply that times your surface area. So we're able to catch about 15,000 gallons off of our roof, which is probably roughly average for the average size home in Flagstaff. But you don't need a 15,000 gallon water storage tank, because you're not going to be catching all your water at once. We catch most of our water from August to March or April, and so this is really handy. And so I went ahead and calculated, and this is really helpful too. You want to go ahead and calculate how much rainwater you're catching per month. And then based on that, you want to get something, if you're going to buy a water storage tank, that'll store water through the winter, where you're catching a good amount of water through the winter. But you can keep in mind that come spring you're going to start using it, and then probably during monsoons you're going to be using it. So our water storage tank is 2,300 gallon water storage tank, and we're able to we will be able to catch water, and that'll be a full tank come springtime, and then we'll use it through the spring when we go through our really dry months. And then once we get into monsoon season, then it'll be kind of using and then refilling, using and then refilling. And one big rainstorm can probably fill that tank. So keep that in mind, that you don't necessarily need as big of a tank as you think you're going to need. And depending on how much area you're planning on irrigating, you might need a significantly smaller water tank, and then you just go ahead and do the rest of it as passive rainwater catchment. So like I said again, I'll go ahead and make sure that all of this information is linked in the description. It'll probably take you to our website so that you can see all this information and calculate your own rainwater catchment and what you're going to need to so you can figure out how you want to go ahead and store it. Otherwise, please go ahead if you have any questions. That's kind of the downside of this not being the workshop, is you can't ask questions directly, but if you go ahead and leave questions in the comment, or you can email us at flagstafflily@gmail.com if you have any other questions. There are also a lot of companies in town that have that can set up rainwater catchment systems for you, that have a good idea of what would work well for you. We unfortunately don't do rainwater catchment ourselves, but we do really encourage it, strongly encourage people to consider doing that themselves. And feel free to like and subscribe, and follow us on our other social media platforms. We're on Facebook, I'm trying to do the Instagram thing, and check out our website as well. We'll continue selling throughout the season. We'll be at the Flagstaff Farmers Market. We'll probably have a couple more pop-up sales, and we'll be at the Arboretum sale later this year in September. I think it's September 9th. So hopefully we'll see you guys there.